Gladiators. When we hear that word, we often think about brave, powerful warriors that fought epic battles within the arenas of ancient Rome, and while they were really celebrated like sports heroes today, there is more than what meets the eye. Welcome to Past Perspectives, and in today's video we are taking a look behind the romanticized curtain. We have it Gladiators and dive into the cruel reality of the blood-soaked life of gladiators in ancient Rome, and by the end of this video you will see the unvarnished reality of being a gladiator. Because beyond the cheering spectators, these warriors faced a life that was anything but glamorous. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you get to know the historic figures behind the dates and facts you learned in school. To understand the life of a gladiator, we need to first take a quick look at the society of the ancient Rome, a society that was as complex as it was brutal, contrary to the romanticized picture of gladiators we often imagine. Even though these warriors were celebrated like professional athletes when they were fighting in the arena, most of them were on the lowest rung of the social ladder. The arenas weren't filled with free men that chose this career because of a thirst of glory. No, most of the gladiators were far from free. They were slaves, prisoners of war and condemned criminals, men stripped of their freedom and thrown into the arena as a form of entertainment for the roaring crowds. Picture it, men from conquered lands, men who once had homes and families, now forced to fight and possibly die for the amusement of their captors. But there is also a part that might surprise you. Not every gladiator was forced into this life. There have been Roman citizens that voluntarily traded their life of security and freedom for the life of a gladiator. They were the so-called octoreti and willingly signed themselves into the gladiator schools for a set period. Their motives have usually been the prospect of fame, glory, money, or simply extremely desperate circumstances. After they ended up in a ludus, which was the gladiator school, they woke up every day to a life of grueling physical exertion and the constant threat of having a violent death. Their training was as brutal as the fights they were fighting for, and while they were not fighting with real swords but with wooden training swords, the intensity they had could be compared to the intensity they showed in the arena. Every day, for hours on end, these men were molded into lethal combatants. Their bodies and minds were relentlessly shaped for the deadly spectacle of the arena. But the training to become a gladiator could take some time, and it was a massive financial investment of the dominus. For them, it took from 4 months up to 2 years to prepare a gladiator for a fight. For example, if it was a soldier captured by the Romans that had the strength and skills but not the technique, it took from 4 to 6 months. But if a farmer was bought by a ludus, it took way more than a year. These gladiators were trained under the watchful eyes of their doctores, who themselves were often experienced ex-gladiators who drilled them in the arts of combat. Here they learned to handle a variety of weapons, from swords and spears to nets and tridents. But their training did not only teach them how to fight and kill other people, it also prepared them on how to die with honor and glory, which can be quite chilling if you think about it. Now their lifestyle was also only focused on efficiency in the arena to make their ludus money. Therefore, they knew that their diet had to focus on a protein diet, which surprisingly was primarily vegetarian. This got supplemented with a concoction known as gladiator's drink, a mix of vinegar and ash believed to strengthen their bodies. They were fed to survive, to build muscle mass, and withstand injuries, not for pleasure or enjoyment. Their living conditions mirrored the harshness of their lives. They were often housed in cramped barrack-style quarters within the ludus, their world reduced to the arena, the training grounds, and their shared living spaces. They had little to no personal freedom, their lives revolving around the brutal cycle of training and combat, all under the watchful eyes of their owners and guards. So here you can already see that the life of a gladiator was far more than just fighting in the arena, but a life of relentless discipline, deprivation, and danger. But their life only becomes more brutal from this point on. Once they were ready to set foot in the arena, their life got even more cruel than it was in the ludus, and often they faced an early ending. Contrary to the common belief that every battle in the arena ended with death, This was not always the case because, again, training, feeding, and housing these gladiators was expensive, and for the Domini, this was a business they wanted to see a return on their investment. But this does not mean that it was less brutal for the gladiators, and in some cases, death would have even been the better option. The days in the arena started in the morning. On special days, the games would begin with exotic animal hunts, which were called venaciones, to heat up the crowd and to show the dominance over nature. However, fighting against animals was not seen often and only carried out in the biggest of arenas. As noon, the meridiani started, which meant the noon executions. This was when the crowd got to see blood and death. Under the harsh Roman sunlight, the condemned, usually criminals, prisoners of war, and enemies of the state would be thrown into the arena to fight wild beasts or very well-trained gladiators, which was to ensure their death and to amuse the spectators. A lot of the times, these enemies of Rome fought blindfolded and with helmets without eye holes. Additionally to that, they weren't allowed to wear any armor, often fighting only in loincloths and sandals. As the day carried on, it was time for the gladiators to step into stage. The heroes of the arena, the gladiators, would finally start their games. Each gladiator type had its own specialized weapons and armor, from the retiarius, armed with a net and trident, to the heavily armored secutor. Yet beneath the roaring applause and the spectacle of combat lay a brutal reality. Even though they were seen as rock stars, for them, it was the fight for survival. The fights were vicious, bloody, and often fatal. Gladiators would clash, their weapons ringing out over the roars of the crowd. The sand beneath their feet, dyed red, was a harsh testament to the day's events. The victory brought cheers and adoration from the crowd, yet defeat, more often than not, meant a gruesome death. Those that have not been killed during the combat but were defeated would then be reliant on the mercy of the arbiter. As a sign that you were defeated after a fight, you could raise your fingers and beg for your life, but this was far from guaranteed. And even if their life was spared a lot of the time, they would be wounded heavily, and they had to rely on their dominus to provide for their medical care, and their decision was dependent on their performance on the arena. If they didn't provide for their gladiator, they would face a slow and painful death through infections, starvation, or bleeding to death. On the other side, refusing to fight was also no option, as this would have led to a direct execution. Therefore, it's important to remember that for many gladiators, the fame and glory was just a glimpse of the life of servitude, violence, and early death they faced. And even if you have been the best gladiator, you were either lucky and you could fight for your freedom, which rarely happened as the ludus was making a lot of money from you, but most of the time at one point, your performance in the arena would get worse and you had to face the reality of death. Yes, there have been some gladiators who were awarded a rudus, a wooden sword, which was their token of freedom, but for most, freedom was a dream they could hardly dare to dream. And for the rare few who did earn their freedom, their life skills were limited to the bloody ballet of the arena, barely useful in civilian life. And if you weren't the best gladiator, which was true for most, fame and riches were just dreams far out of reach. And if we break it down, the lives of most gladiators were brief and cruel, far from the Hollywood tales of glory and the ones you see in movies. Sure, crowds cheered for them, but behind the applause was a dark reality. People often think of gladiators as stars, with their names shouted by thousands of fans, their faces carved out of stone, and their performance the talk of the town. But the actual picture was different. They were considered outcasts by the high society, valuable only for their ability to bring spectacle to the bloody arena. Regardless of the deafening cheers and glimmers of glory, the unvarnished truth was that gladiators were chained to the arena until their final breath. Their existence, fraught with violence and uncertainty, was a spectacle for others to watch, their untimely deaths the grand finale to their shattered dreams. Despite the short-lived fame, the life of a gladiator was far from the romanticized picture we often see. Their reality was a constant battle, a struggle for survival, and a cycle of bloodshed that only ended in death. Now, before we end this video, make sure to subscribe to Past Perspectives to learn about all the history topics you have never learned about in school and get to know the lives of the people behind the facts and dates. Also, let us know down in the comments which topics you want us to cover next. With that being said, thanks for watching, and until next time at Past Perspectives.